Okay, so we're moving on to the final category of rocks, metamorphic rocks. And metamorphic rocks form when any other rock is subjected to high enough heat and pressure that it undergoes changes in the texture, in the mineralogy, or in both. Usually it actually happens with both texture and the minerals. And in these pictures here, this is actually a mountain made of schist, which is a type of foliated metamorphic rock that often forms when sediments, like ocean sediments, are converted from heat, are first converted into sedimentary rock, and then that sedimentary rock is converted into an extremely different rock by heat and pressure. This often occurs at convergent plate boundaries, and this is actually from my field site in Antarctica, and the rocks I was studying were actually from an ancient convergent plate boundary where the rocks were metamorphosed. And this is what a lot of the rocks looked like close up. They looked like they had been put through a taffy puller. And that's something you see with a lot of metamorphic rocks that have been subjected to really high levels of heat and pressure. So this lab will be due on Monday, April 12th at 11:59 p.m. And there's also a quiz that is combined on labs 6 and 7 on both sediments and sedimentary rocks that's due that day as well. We're actually approaching the end of the term. We only have 2 labs left after this. And then there's also a final exam at the end of the term. And I think I will put out a study guide for that next week. I will aim to do that because we're getting to the end of getting new lab content. Now, remember also, if you have questions about the sedimentary rocks before you take the quiz, feel free to shoot me an email or also use the discussion boards on Canvas for that. And another thing I wanted to mention is that I mentioned in a previous lecture that Cal State University Northridge has a series of geology seminars that AVC students are welcome to attend. And there's one happening on, I guess this would indeed be next Tuesday, April 13th, from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. A graduate student from Stanford is talking about her research with geoscience education, actually. But her background is in geoscience education, but she's talking about how she'll be talking about how, with a geoscience background, you can effectively measure hazards in the environment or the workplace. So it's possibly a good talk if you might be interested in what sort of careers can come out of a geology background that aren't necessarily teaching at a university. And that's something you can write about for extra credit, which is something that can get you points on one of your quizzes or labs. So any questions about this material? And the Zoom link is here if you need to come back to it later. These slides are already uploaded. Okay then, so according to the rock cycle, any rock, whether it's igneous, sedimentary, or another metamorphic rock, can be fundamentally changed into a different type of rock by heat, pressure, or both. And we've seen this diagram before, and I've pointed out that it actually has a helpful reference point in that it puts Earth's surface here, and it shows you that exposed rocks, aka outcrops, are, for example, eroded into sediments. And sedimentary rocks form when sediments are buried. Now, metamorphic rocks frequently form when rocks are buried especially deep, whether those are previously formed metamorphic rocks or sedimentary rocks or igneous rocks. Metamorphic rocks are usually changed by, well, they're going to be changed usually by a combination of heat and pressure, sometimes more heavily by one or the other. And the reason that in general they put metamorphic rocks on here is that in general, heat and pressure go up as you go deeper into the Earth. So any questions about any of the elements of the rock cycle before I move on? So a metamorphic rock is defined as a rock that has formed from another rock. It's formed from another rock that has experienced changes in texture, mineralogy, or both, from either heat, pressure, or a combination of heat and pressure. And an analogy is that metamorphism kind of functions like a pressure cooker. The changes in pressure and heat put together are usually what cause these changes that cause, for example, what does this this is a metamorphic rock, but does this remind you all of any of the other rocks you've seen, say in the igneous portion of this class?
Diorite or diorite?
Yeah, actually, this looks a lot like diorite, and this is in fact a type of gneiss, which is a metamorphic rock that formed from diorite. And you'll notice it sort of looks like someone melted it and then turned the heat off, and it was allowed to congeal back together. Diorite is a lot of separate crystals that are all scattered about, but this is kind of more stripy and melded together. And then we have a calc-silicate rock here, which we'll talk about, and then a schist here that has some prominent minerals. And does anyone know what these minerals are? These beautiful red ones here.
Garnet.
Yep, that's garnet, which is one of the minerals you'll be seeing in today's lab. And that's a common metamorphic mineral. So remember that when we talked about sedimentary rocks, Diogenesis is a term I introduced briefly, and it's an umbrella term for the series of processes that convert sediment into a sedimentary rock. The compacting and stratifying and cementing of sedimentary rocks. And you'll notice that's on the same diagram as all these other zones here. And all these other zones actually represent different types of metamorphism. And an interesting thing to think about is that metamorphism and diagenesis are on the same scale, but diagenesis occurs below a certain temperature cutoff. Because rocks usually have to reach a temperature of around 200 degrees Celsius before processes that we would consider metamorphism actually begin, before we get substantial recrystallization, before we get the old minerals actually turning into new types of minerals. And it can be a bit of an arbitrary distinction. And likewise, actually, there's a bit of an arbitrary distinction. There's a bit of a fuzzy line when you get to very high grades of metamorphism, when that actually relies on the minerals being decrystallized and recrystallized. If you go much higher, you simply get melting. You simply get partial melting. And very high grade metamorphism is actually a lot like a very low grade form of partial melting, which isn't something you need to worry about a whole lot, but it's just interesting to think about how there is a bit of this spectrum. So the pressure increases as you go inside of Earth's surface because you have the weight of the overlying rocks and sediments, and it also gets hotter as you go inside of the Earth because you're getting closer to the core. Now, heat that can cause metamorphism can also be supplied by a lava flow or a flow of hydrothermal fluid coming from a volcanic eruption. So it is possible for metamorphism to occur without rocks being buried. And we'll talk about how there's a distinction between regional metamorphism, which usually does involve burial, and what's known as contact metamorphism, when you simply have a single lava flow or a single release of volcanic fluids causing a reaction in an isolated spot, often with very little in the way of pressure changes and often occurring pretty near to the surface. So metamorphism occurs between temperatures of about 200 degrees Celsius with a higher range of somewhere between 850 and 1000 degrees Celsius. And at pressures higher than 2 kbar, which is about what you get when you go 5 kilometers below the ground, that's when you get metamorphism, as opposed to just simple compacting of sedimentary rocks and diogenesis. So any questions for this before I keep going? So metamorphism to a big extent is all about pressure and temperature. And we use a general term to refer to both, to refer to whether metamorphism is occurring at high temperatures and pressures or at relatively low temperatures and pressures. And when I say relatively low, I mean that it's still happening above 200 degrees Celsius, still above 5 kbar, aka temperatures and pressures that would kill any living thing, and which make it so that we can't obviously be observing this happening directly outside of simulating it in labs, but relatively low compared to, say, 1000 degrees Celsius and about 10 kbars of pressure, which is what you get in some of the highest grade examples. So metamorphic grade indicates how heavily the rocks have been metamorphosed, essentially. High-grade metamorphic rocks form at higher pressures and temperatures. And in this example on the right, we often will have a diagram like this that shows how a starting rock can actually change pressure and temperature over time, what's known as a metamorphic path. And in this example, the low grade zone along this path is, say, about in the range of 300 to 400 degrees Celsius and about 4 kbar. Now, what is actually happening to the rock to bring it to higher grades? What could bring it? What is actually physically happening to the rock to bring it to higher grades?
The depth is increasing?
Yes, exactly. It's being buried even deeper, precisely. So metamorphic grade usually goes up as rocks are buried deeper. You do have one interesting example here where actually the pressure goes up a lot faster than the temperature in a subduction zone because that burial happens pretty quickly. But if the burial happens over time, both the pressure and temperature go up at about the same rate. And the path I'm showing here, all these paths here are actually known as prograde metamorphism. Prograde metamorphism indicates that the temperature and pressure are progressively going up over time. Now, there's actually another term, retrograde metamorphism, that refers to what can happen to rocks when the temperature and pressure they've been at actually starts to decrease over time. And one common example of that is when tectonic forces actually cause rocks to be uplifted, say when a bunch of rock on top is eroded, or when there's a divergent plate boundary and that causes rocks to pop up. And so you can see here that sometimes scientists can plot that they can, with an individual mineral or rock, they can plot that a rock has been buried and then actually exhumed or uplifted at a later time. And the really cool thing about that is that you can sometimes look at rock samples and look at the individual minerals. These are actually crystals of garnet, the same mineral you were looking at before. And garnet is a mineral that forms large crystals at especially high grades. And so you have large garnet crystals here indicating this rock reached a high grade. But as it was exhumed, the garnet, which is most stable, especially with big crystals like this, most stable at high temperatures and pressures, buried deep in the Earth's surface, it becomes less stable as you bring it up to the relatively lower pressures and temperatures near the surface. And so you get what's known as a reaction rim. You get the garnet decomposing actually into another mineral and experiencing retrograde metamorphism. Now, is it the entire garnet crystal that's decomposed here, or is it just a little bit?
A little bit?
Yeah, it's just a little bit. What do you think that means about how fast the uplift happened? Do you think it was fast or slow? Did it have a lot of time? Did it have a lot of time to convert back into the old mineral, or did it have not very much time?
It seems like it would be fast.
Precisely, yes. It was uplifted relatively fast, and that actually means that there's not a lot of time for the retrograde reaction to occur. Precisely. And the cool thing about this is it can give us some clues about when and how fast uplift happened, and that's one reason why geologists study metamorphic rocks. So before I keep going, any questions?
Where do these actually happen at, like, locations wise?
This is from Norway, I think, actually, and you get it where you mean where so the burial happens often in subduction zones and where you have continental collision, like in the Himalaya. And Norway isn't experiencing continental collision now, but it has in the geologic past. And this picture is from some research some people at my university were doing. And the uplift then happens when, if there's a heavy amount of erosion, removing rock on top, that causes rock to uplift. Some really good examples of places with metamorphic rock in the US, you find them at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and otherwise they wouldn't be exposed or visible if the Colorado River hadn't cut down and exposed them. You often find the oldest rock on Earth that is very heavily metamorphosed, rock from Precambrian times, rock from 600 to 700 million years ago, because it's been buried by so much subsequent deposition of rocks, usually sedimentary rocks. Is that sort of what you were getting at?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you find metamorphic rocks all over. You often find them buried very deep. And they can actually be kind of hard to find, but sometimes we get lucky. In Antarctica, when I was looking at the rocks there, what had actually happened was that a lot of the overlying rocks, the volcanic rocks, had been eroded over time, and so you had some of the underlying metamorphic rocks exposed. Speaking of which, actually, that's what's happening here. This actually all used to be covered with other sediments and with volcanic rocks, or extrusive igneous rocks, if you will, but those are all gone now, and you just now have the underlying metamorphosed rocks that are also crisscrossed with some intrusive igneous rocks, some of these dikes, the black stripes you can see in here. And these rocks formed from a mountain building episode, and that's what I was studying when I was in Antarctica. And this was a mountain building episode that occurred 600, actually closer to 500 million years ago. And I bring this up because one distinction that you can make with metamorphic rocks is that between regional and contact metamorphism. And regional metamorphism is any metamorphism brought about by a large-scale tectonic process, like subduction or mountain building, that occurs over a wide area, aka along a significant length of a plate boundary. In contrast, contact metamorphism is basically local metamorphism. It's where you have a metamorphic reaction occurring at a single outcrop or in a single vein, and I'll give a few examples of that later. Most metamorphism is regional. Regional metamorphism dominates quite a bit, but we're interested in contact metamorphism because some of the processes involved in it create minerals that we're interested in economically. Deposits of copper and gold, for example, actually often come from contact metamorphism incidents. And the interesting thing about contact metamorphism is that usually it doesn't involve much of a pressure change. Often contact metamorphism happens fairly close to the Earth's surface, and it'll be brought about by heated water, by heated fluids from a volcano, or by magma itself. And don't worry about the details of this diagram, but it's kind of meant to show you that sediments are being shoved up between plates that are colliding, and how these rising bodies are representing that magma is involved in this. And the cool thing is that you often find metamorphic rocks from regional metamorphism alongside igneous rocks, because the same processes that cause melting and cause volcanoes and plutons to form also, you will also, especially in the case of continental collision, like you'll have a plate that's subducting approaching, and then there'll be land on the plate, and the land will collide, and there will be ocean sediments that get caught up between the two, and those sediments will be metamorphosed into metamorphic rock, which is what happened with the area I was working in Antarctica. And this occurred all along a plate boundary that used to exist, in East Antarctica. And you see this pattern, you see these gneisses and schists found alongside these granites, these intrusive igneous rocks, all along what used to be this plate boundary for hundreds of miles, not just at a single location. And again, why are the intrusive igneous rocks exposed? What's happened to the extrusive ones? You usually find both volcanic or extrusive ones and intrusive or plutonic igneous rocks in the same place. But if you can only see the plutonic rocks, what happened to the volcanic ones? Something got rid of them. What do we call that? Erosion. Erosion, which is again what breaks down rocks into sediments, actually will break down the volcanic rocks first. And that's what we have in the Sierra Nevada in California, actually. That's why you have features like El Capitan, which is made of granite, which forms underground, but that's exposed at the surface now because the volcanic rocks that used to be on top of it have since been eroded. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to tie this back to something we learned about igneous rocks. Now, contact metamorphism again, usually just occurs at a small spot. One example is a calc-silicate rock, which forms when you have it forms when you have either a pluton or a lava flow coming into contact with another rock that's made of carbonate, like limestone, a sedimentary rock that we talked about a fair bit, or marble. Hold on, actually, there we go. Sorry, I accidentally left both. I fixed up the slide and left both versions in. This makes the pictures bigger. But it comes into contact with limestone or marble, which is actually a metamorphic rock that forms from limestone and that is also largely made of the mineral calcite. And what happens is that you get these fluids coming from the magma cause reactions with the carbonate, and the fluid, if you look closely here, you can see that there's SiO4 negative, there's K+, there's Mg2+. That's to show that there's ions dissolved in that fluid. And fluids are important because, again, they often carry ions the same way that when rocks break down chemically, water carries ions away from the rock. And what happens here is that you get a combination of these ions coming from the granitoid and then the calcium from the carbonate rock, and CO2 gets released as a gas, and that forms this little interesting band of minerals that have both calcium and silica in them, which is why this is known as a calc-silicate rock. And this is about how big, you can see this is my pencil here, and this is about how big of a zone you get for calc-silicate rocks. This will usually occur at just a couple of isolated locations. This is something I studied a little bit in college, and there were perhaps 3 or 4 different calc-silicate locations in the area that I was studying, but it wasn't a band of them that occurred all up and down that plate boundary that had existed before. And another example of contact metamorphism is when fluids from magma, often from magma, will pass through veins and cracks in the rock. And when the water gets evaporated or dissipated, it'll leave behind the ions that were previously dissolved in it as solid minerals. So you'll get copper as well as associated copper minerals like azurite and malachite, as well as silver and gold left behind. And this is often how we get veins of minerals that are those that are considered to be economically worthwhile. They're left behind by a contact metamorphism process. And in general, an important agent of metamorphic change is collectively what's known as hydrothermal fluids. It's also possible for CO2 gas to cause metamorphism on its own. A fluid can refer to either liquids or gases, and CO2 released from magma can pass through rocks and actually leave behind carbonate as well. And a general term for changes in composition from hydrothermal alteration is known as metasomatism. A really good example, aside from the ones I mentioned, of this are actually the black smokers you get on the ocean floor, where you have cold water sinking through cracks on the ocean floor, getting heated by magma from underneath. This often occurs at divergent plate boundaries, actually. This is the divergent plate boundary. What does this feature look like to you, where you've got the plates spreading on either side? It's a mid-ocean ridge. And at mid-ocean ridges, you get a lot of black smokers because you have interaction between the seawater and the magma. The heated seawater actually causes some metamorphism of the rocks, and that's part of what you see with black smokers. An important term that will come up in today's lab is the protolith, which refers to the rock that a metamorphic rock formed from, or the rock that it used to be, you could say. And when we look at a metamorphic rock, we can obtain clues about what the protolith was from either the chemistry, which means either looking at the minerals or running chemical tests. In your case, you'll be looking at the minerals because in some cases, the protolith can be pretty easily determined by figuring out what mineral is involved. For example, marble is made of calcite, and it forms from limestone, which is also almost entirely made of the mineral calcite. And it's not always as simple as that, because some metamorphic rocks have many more minerals, but we will learn that much of the time, the metamorphic rocks that have distinct foliation, that have distinct lines, start out as shale or start out as a sedimentary rock made of mud. And as it gets metamorphosed more over time, it'll start to metamorphose more and show more distinct lines. And we'll go through that in an upcoming slide. You can also figure out the protolith by looking at the texture and also at the tectonic setting of where the rock is. And I mentioned that metamorphic processes involve changes in either mineralogy or texture. Most of the time, a rock that is being metamorphosed is going to see changes in both the minerals that are involved as well as the texture. Now, on the left side actually is one example of a rock changing that doesn't have much of a mineral change. This is quartz sandstone actually, and when it gets metamorphosed into a rock known as quartzite. And both rocks are almost entirely made of quartz, but you'll notice that the crystals aren't the same shape here. They look like they've sort of melted together and then regrown, and that's more or less precisely what's happened. But you do sometimes get completely new minerals forming. This is shale, or the mud sedimentary rock, and this is a metamorphic rock, a schist that forms from it. And these garnet crystals were not there before. The garnet was not present when the protolith, shale, existed by itself. But when the shale was buried, the pressure and temperature actually caused new minerals to grow. And sometimes what'll happen is that the edges of the crystals will dissolve and regrow with a new and different shape. You'll get something known as grain boundary migration, where you can still see the individual grains, the individual crystals fairly well, but you can tell that they're not where they used to be. And I mentioned earlier that it's hard to observe any of this unless you have a simulation in a lab, and they have actually developed chambers in which they can bring the pressure and temperature enough to regrow quartz, essentially. Now, aside from the boundaries changing shapes, what else do you notice about how the crystals are changing as you go from the start of this video to the end of this video?
They're getting larger.
Yes, they're getting larger, precisely. And that's something else I'll mention, that as pressure and temperature go up, that actually will cause crystals to be larger in general. And, oops, I meant to start the other one. There we go. Not quite as obvious in this one. Anyhow, I really do like how in these two, there we go. Okay, the second video more or less shows the same thing as the first. Sorry, the little player is overlapping here, but you get the idea that the boundaries of the crystals will change, and also the crystals will get bigger. And so these are quartzite, which is again, it's a rare example of a metamorphic rock that doesn't experience much in the way of mineral change at all. And another good example is marble. And the interesting thing about marble is that, remember that when we talked about calcite in class before, I mentioned that calcite by itself is a clear colorless mineral, but you'll often see samples of calcite that are all different colors, like light blue or pink or green or orange, and that this comes about as a result of impurities. For the most part, calcite is just calcium carbonate, but there's little bits of metal ions mixed in, and since the starting material, the calcium carbonate, is colorless, a little bit of impurity goes a long way in adding color. And that's actually one reason why, that's why marble has these beautiful bands and why marble is so heavily prized as an architectural stone. Because when marble forms from limestone, which may have these impurities because that's in the calcite, it's still going to be calcite. The crystals get bigger and they change shape. And what also happens is that the impurities get concentrated into these bands. They get concentrated into these lines. And so that's actually how you get the patterns in marble. It comes from the concentration and the banding of these impurities from a metamorphic process. Also, the crystals get sheared. What'll happen is that not only do the crystals get squished because you have pressure, usually have pressure occurring more strongly vertically than horizontally because it's the weight of the overlying stuff squishing it, but you'll also sometimes when the heat goes up, the crystals are a bit more plastic, sort of like how the asthenosphere is sort of a plasticky solid that can bend and stretch. It's more easy to stretch the crystals out without completely destroying their form or causing them to completely break. And what's happening in this diagram you see is that a relatively regular shape, a hexagon, is sort of pulled in opposite directions and stretched out. And that's something we see in metamorphic rocks frequently. This is an example of a metamorphic rock, a gneiss, that has porphyroblasts that have these little fish tails on them. And you can see that these fish tails come from the crystals being sort of partially remelted, but not enough that they completely become a liquid, just enough that they can sort of be stretched out. And when we look at metamorphic rocks on a microscope, we can make educated guesses about the direction of shearing. And if we're careful about marking the orientation of the rock when we took it, when we look at the crystals under a microscope, we can make educated guesses about the directions of shearing, which can give us a sense of what, in terms of plate tectonics, was going on at the time, what was causing this. Now, in many metamorphic rocks, most of them, you get some new mineral growth. And it's rather interesting to me how you get new minerals without completely melting the rock. There's two processes usually. In one process, known as diffusion, you actually get extremely slow movement of atoms from one mineral to the other, and thus causing a rearranging of chemical structures while they're still solid. However, you also sometimes get a momentary melting when either the whole crystal or just the outer edges of the crystal, kind of like you saw with the quartz earlier, gets reacted with by fluids, and then it'll regrow as an entirely different mineral. And this isn't something you'll have to worry about too much for this class, but if you get into more advanced petrology classes, a lot of the study involves coming up with plausible combinations of starting minerals that could have yielded the minerals that you see in the current metamorphic rock you're looking at under a set of pressure and temperature conditions that make sense. One thing I want to ask, so the starting rock in this example is on the left, and the finished rock is on the right. Do you think the one on the left was igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary to begin with?
It had to be metamorphic because there's garnet in it.
Precisely. Even if you weren't looking at the garnet, what's some other good evidence that this is a metamorphic rock itself on the left? Like, what about the shape of the grains? They sort of look glued together. In both of these, they kind of look like they're glued together and that the shapes have sort of melted together. And both with the garnet, the presence of garnet as well as that, this gives you an indication that yes, metamorphic rocks do get metamorphosed. Also, remember how I mentioned prograde metamorphism, how rocks can go from the protolith to low-grade metamorphic rocks at relatively low temperatures and pressures, to medium-grade metamorphic rocks at slightly higher temperatures and pressures, and then to high-grade metamorphic rocks at even higher pressures and temperatures. Or it might go the other way. In this case, actually, I believe this is showing it happening the other way. This is showing a high-grade metamorphic rock breaking down into what we'd basically consider waste products: chlorite, actinolite, and epidote. And in fact, I believe that the green rims you saw on the garnet in the earlier picture are one of these minerals, one of these green metamorphic minerals. And that's the one cool thing about metamorphic rocks is that a lot of the pretty minerals come from them. And some of the minerals that you see in metamorphic rocks, like calcite, biotite, and orthoclase feldspar, also occur in igneous and sedimentary contexts, so you've seen them before. But often the pretty rocks that have vibrant green and red and blue colors are metamorphic rocks. So garnet, as well as a blue mineral, kyanite, that you'll look at, and then serpentinite, which is the green mineral that makes up California's state rock, serpentine. Those are all formed from metamorphic processes. And there are dozens of metamorphic rocks, and new ones are discovered there are dozens of minerals that are mostly found in metamorphic rocks, and new ones are actually discovered frequently because you'll often find a specific mineral in one or two localities. I will say that metamorphic rocks are really good to study if you find just lots of different types of minerals interesting. For this class, there is a flowchart linked in lab 8 that will have a way for you to identify all the minerals that you'll actually have to deal with for this lab. Before I continue, any questions? Just a few more slides. So earlier, you all pointed out that the crystals get bigger as you go from low grade to high grade, and that is indeed true. One cool thing here is that this is slate, which is a very low-grade metamorphic rock that forms from shale, basically as soon as once it gets buried, just deep enough to metamorphose, but not deep enough to really not really experience a lot of change. And I'll have another slide about slate, but slate is hard to tell apart from shale because you can't easily see the minerals with your eye. But if you take slate and cut it very thin and put it under a microscope, you can see very tiny baby garnet crystals growing. So you have garnet in here, you just can't really see it. Whereas in this schist that formed at a much higher grade, you actually have some individual garnet crystals that you can see with the naked eye. You can see that they're about as large as this coin here. And I think this is also from Norway because this is not an American coin they're using here. I think this is another picture from one of my UCSB colleagues' Norway field season. Now, there's a category of metamorphic rocks that I alluded to earlier called foliated metamorphic rocks, and foliated rocks show aligned growth of minerals from differential pressure that is applied more heavily in one direction than the other. So in this example, you can see you start with an igneous rock that simply has crystals facing in all directions because igneous rocks just sort of cool as a blob from magma, and there isn't anything that causes the minerals to grow in any particular direction. But then metamorphic processes begin, the rocks get buried deeper, and stress, whichever direction the stress is more intense in, the minerals will align, they'll align perpendicular to the direction of stress as a way to minimize the impact from that stress. And that produces foliation in this case. These are both gneisses that formed from previous igneous rocks. And the one thing that's a little bit confusing with gneiss and schist is that there is actually kind of like how minerals can occur in different rocks. Gneiss can start out as a couple different things. Gneiss can either form from granites or diorites or other igneous rocks that have been smushed and metamorphosed, or it can form as the end stage highest grade metamorphism involving the sequence of rocks, starting with the sedimentary rock shale. So you won't have to worry too much about that distinction, but if you're wondering why I've referred to gneiss as sometimes coming from granite and sometimes coming from shale, that's why. And so often a number of these different rocks can have different protoliths, but there's a sequence involving shale being metamorphosed to slate, being metamorphosed to phylate, being metamorphosed into schist, and lastly, being metamorphosed into gneiss. We won't really go over migmatite, but that's a very high-grade gneiss that forms just about on the boundary of where you get melting and formation of igneous rocks instead. And slate which actually you might be familiar with because it's used as a building material, is hard to tell apart from shale because neither of them really has much in the way of visible minerals. It sort of still looks like a mud rock. but it's a bit harder than shale and makes a distinct clinking sound that apparently that clinking sound that it makes is actually from the fact that the texture has changed from the new minerals forming. And it also breaks into platey pieces, what's known as a slatey breakage pattern. You might hear this referred to as cleavage, and just be careful that you're not confusing this with mineral cleavage, because mineral cleavage refers to how minerals break. People also refer to the pattern in which the rock slate breaks apart as cleavage as well. And if you look under a microscope, you can see that new minerals that were not present in the shale are forming, and that you're starting to get a foliation. You just can't really see it yet. Once slate gets metamorphosed a bit more, you get phylate, in which you can't see the individual crystals all that well, but you can see that the phylate is shiny. And that's because the micas, like the muscovite mica you saw in a previous lab, are growing big enough that they're reflecting the light in a way that we can see. Phylate turns into schists, and in a schist, you can actually usually see the crystals with the naked eye. You can actually now see that there's little flecks of mica, either biotite or muscovite on here, and you start to see little garnet crystals growing. And schist is usually going to look like everything is jumbled up, because as it turns out, as the pressure and temperature get really high, it becomes more stable for the mafic or dark colored minerals and the felsic or light colored minerals to separate chemically, because that allows them to be a bit more stable. So in the highest grade foliated metamorphic rocks, or gneisses, you get these really beautiful warped bands of white and black minerals that are more cleanly separated, because that separation occurs at the highest temperatures and pressures. And you also get, if you have porphyroblasts, if you have crystals of garnet or other crystals or other minerals sort of just growing in amidst this, that's when they'll get biggest. I have seen some garnet. This is kind of a small example, and I wish I had the pictures with me, but when I was in New York on a geology trip, I saw some garnet crystals that were about as big as a tennis ball. When I told that to my advisor, he scoffed and was like, "I've seen ones as big as soccer balls in the Himalayas." And I was like, okay, this wasn't meant to be a competition. But and not all metamorphic rocks are foliated. In general, non-foliated metamorphic rocks are going to be defined by the main mineral inside of them, like quartzite being defined by quartz, or marble being defined by being made of calcite. And in general, rocks produced by contact metamorphism are not going to be foliated, because you need high pressures to generate foliation, and contact metamorphism doesn't usually involve much in the way of a pressure change. So I have one more slide going over what's in the lab today, but any questions before I go on to that? And this is a picture from a marble quarry that formed when the rocks that formed from limestone from deep marine ocean sediments were actually compressed up into mountains. And this is actually, you often find metamorphic rocks in mountains because the processes that smush the rocks up into mountains will also metamorphose them in the process. So for today's lab, you'll want to focus on using the tools at your disposal and not overthinking it too much, because there is a lot involved with metamorphic rocks. And I find that teaching metamorphic rocks is probably hardest of the three, because it's the hardest to summarize, just because so many different processes are involved. But question one is a review of some minerals that you've seen before, as well as a few new ones, and all of those minerals are common in metamorphic rocks. There's a flowchart linked in this lab at the start, in the text on Canvas, that you'll want to use. And once you've gone through the metamorphic minerals, you'll want to refer back to the picture and the videos showing them, because the remaining questions are going to be using the pictures of the rocks, the metamorphic rocks, to answer questions about whether you think they're low, medium, or high grade, what types of minerals you think you can see on them based on the minerals in question one. And an easy way to lose points is to come up with minerals that aren't in the set that you've been given. Think that to be like, oh, there's a dark mineral. Could this be biotite, hornblende, or pyroxene? And if hornblende and pyroxene aren't in the list that we gave you, then don't worry about those. And in fact, those don't tend to be as common. Those don't tend to be as common with metamorphic rocks, but that's just one example. You can also, some of the exercises involve naming the rock based on the mineral present, and a few ask about identifying the protolith or identifying the rock they came from. This is figure 2, which you'll want to refer to, because what a diagram like this tells you is that metamorphic rocks with these minerals present together are present at a given range of temperatures and pressures. So, for example, zeolites are a category of mineral you haven't really learned that much about, but they form at low grades of metamorphism. And so if you found zeolites in a metamorphic rock, do you think that metamorphic rock got to pressures of, say, 8 kilobars and 600 degrees Celsius? Eight kilobars is about here. 600 degrees Celsius is about here. So that would put you at a point around here. Is that in the zone that's marked with zeolites?
No.
No, precisely. And so that tells you that that rock would have formed probably at much lower grades. And this is the cool thing about using minerals in metamorphic rocks. We can use the presence or absence of different minerals to make educated guesses about what grade that rock actually got to. So before I shut the recording off, does anyone have questions? All right, then. So I'll be around to help, and I will be posting this video up later in case anybody needs it. So shutting the recording off in just a moment.